I'd like now to introduce the chair of the panel, the Honourable Melissa Park MP. And Melissa, as well as being a former Australian Labor politician, is a UN human rights expert. And prior to entering Australian Parliament, Melissa served as an international lawyer with the United Nations in Kosovo, Gaza, New York and Lebanon. And since her retirement from Parliament, Melissa's been appointed as an eminent expert on Yemen for the UN Human Rights Council, investigating violations of international law committed by parties to the conflict in Yemen. Please welcome Melissa.
Thank you, Margaret. Now, can everyone hear me? Yes. Yes? Can everybody hear? Thank you, Margaret, and welcome to our wonderful audience. We've brought together today an internationally acclaimed panel of experts in human rights, gender-based violence and modern-day slavery. Today we'll be unpacking patriarchal structures and unequal power relations that underpin gender inequality globally. We'll also be discussing sustainable pathways for building a better world, with investment in women and girls at the very centre of that. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the unceded land of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I think, particularly given today's topic, that we acknowledge the role of Indigenous women in nurturing this land for tens of thousands of years. And I also think it's important that we acknowledge the very deep need in this country for a comprehensive truth-telling in order to be able to move forward in reconciliation, in healing and mutual understanding. And just before I introduce our panellists for today, I'd like to just let you know that this empty chair here is representing all of the women and girls who are voiceless in the world because of modern day slavery. Now, our distinguished panel today, firstly we have Grace Forrest, is the founding director of Walk Free and is a director of the Minderoo Foundation and the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue. In 2018, Grace was appointed the United Nations Association of Australia's youngest ever Goodwill Ambassador for Anti-Slavery. That same year, Grace was awarded the NOMI Network Abolitionist Award for her work to end modern slavery and won the GQ Australia Humanitarian of the Year Award. To find out more about Walk Free, please visit the gazebo, where you can also pick up a copy of Grace's bespoke photo series. The Walk Free gazebo is just over there to my right. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Anne Ali. Dr. Ali has been the federal member for Cowan since 2016. Anne is an internationally renowned expert and has published more than 100 articles and books on topics related to terrorism and international security. The founder of People Against Violent Extremism, Anne was the only Australian representative to speak at President Obama's 2015 White House Summit on countering violent extremism. In 2011, Anne was inducted into the WA Women's Hall of Fame, and in 2014 she was named one of Australia's 100 most influential women by Westpac and the Financial Review. In 2016, Anne was nominated for the Australian of the Year and received the prestigious Australian Security Medal. And Dr. Carol Kaplanian, in the centre here, has completed a PhD on honour-based violence in Jordan and has been awarded a 2020 Churchill Fellowship to investigate family and domestic violence among the migrant and refugee population. She specialises in clinical counselling and working with victims of torture and trauma, the latter of which involved spending an extensive amount of time working in Jordanian refugee camps, offering counselling and education to refugees. Today, she is the State Coordinator for Female Genital Cutting and Mutilation Program at the Women and Newborn Health Service. She's also responsible
Yeah.
She's also responsible for developing training on family and domestic violence. Carol has worked in clinical settings with refugee and migrant women, as well as women who have experienced family violence. So a big welcome to all of our panellists. Now, we know that gender inequality tends to be rooted in notions of patriarchal norms and attitudes that persist in every society around the world. So my first question to all of our panellists is, have you seen these structural disadvantages reflected in your own lives or in your fields of work, and in what way? And I think we'll just go to Dr. Ali first.
Thank you, Melissa, and welcome everyone to what I think has already started off as a really interesting day and proves to be continue to be a really interesting day. That's a really interesting question, Melissa, because where do I start in terms of my life? You know, I grew up in a kind of a cultural context where the most I could have hoped for in my life as a girl child was to attract a suitable partner. From a young age, I was raised to aspire to getting married. That was very much an expectation on me. And, you know, the expectation was that if I didn't behave in certain ways, that if I didn't do certain things, then I wouldn't get married. I wouldn't be able to attract a suitable partner. Well, I showed them, because I'm on husband number 3, so there. So, you know, I think culturally and those kinds of traditional structures and traditional norms that I grew up with, but certainly, you know, now as a member of Parliament, our parliamentary system is one of the most patriarchal institution in the nation. I think that, you know, the fact that Australia struggles to imagine a female leader, a female Prime Minister in Australia, I think really is testimony to that. And even in academia, as an academic, and particularly in the field where I worked in counterterrorism and security, which was a very male-dominated field when I first started, but has, particularly international security, has started to attract more women, and I mentor a whole lot of young women who want to get into that field as well. So yeah, I think that the way in which patriarchy works in a professional or in a kind of a social context can be quite different, but the impacts, I think, is what we need to be looking at. The impacts that has on the lives of girls and women to achieve what it is they want to achieve, to be able to imagine for themselves, for young women in particular, imagine for themselves a future where they are leaders, where they do aspire to achieving wonderful things and their full potential, I think, is where we need to be putting our focus.
Great, thank you. Dr.
Yeah, like Anne, I don't know where to begin, I suppose. Growing up in the Middle East, I'm of Jordanian, Palestinian and Armenian heritage. So in many ways, I have seen the discrimination and the inequality rooted at the very heart of my ethnicity and who I am as a person. And in many ways, that's what pushed me and to do the work that I do today. Identifying as an Arab woman, I really do understand my privilege. I understand how lucky I am to be educated and to be able to have a voice, because the reality where I grew up, I'm probably 1 or 2% of the population, and this is something that stays with me every day in the work that I do. I have seen inequality in my work, and I've seen it on a personal level, rooted on a daily basis. When I was doing my PhD, the majority of my studies and my data collection was done in the Middle East, in Jordan in particular. And the one thing that I still don't know how to put words to it was how objectified the victims who were murdered in the name of an honor killing were, and how nameless, they had no name. They were simply a number. And the way my participants spoke about the issue of honor killings and extreme violence against women was still in a manner of objectification. And for me, this goes against everything I stand for. For me, the most integral thing in my life is to give a voice to women who are at the center of violence, who are living in their life where they should have a voice, but they are not able to have a voice. I see it every day here in Australia. Hello? Yeah. I see it every day here in Australia, where you think we live in such an amazing and abundant country, but the issue of violence, slavery, servitude, forced marriage is amongst us. It's everywhere you look. It's there. We just have to look properly and recognize it. And that is what I aim to do with the likes of these incredible women that I'm here with. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Carol. And Grace?
I think I want to continue on that theme about vast, big numbers, because as you would have seen in the video we played earlier, we're estimating that 1 in every 130 women and girls on Earth are living in modern slavery. That number is not only astounding, but it's truly international. Slavery, human trafficking, forced marriage, domestic servitude, these extreme forms of inequality, these extreme forms of violence, they exist in every single country on Earth. And when we talk about that in absolute terms, we're talking about over 40 million people, living in slavery in the world today. That's more than any other time in human history. And the kicker is, it is connected to each and every one of us. It could be as close as the shirt on your back, to the technology we rely on, to the coffee you drank this morning. So systems of entrenched inequality, which absolutely exist in Australia and certainly around the world, this year has shown us that we are all connected to it, and it does all relate to each of us. In my field of work of modern slavery, we know that together with geography, gender is the most determining factor of your life outcomes. And I think that also comes back to that really important conversation around privilege and luck, genetic lottery, where you're born. The fact that, for the most part in Australia, as a girl, your education will be valued equally to your brothers, which I have a brother. That's it's actually not common, and it's not okay. And I think that part of the research that I'm going to try and break down today around stacked odds looks at the fact that for women and girls around the world, the odds are stacked against them from before they are born and throughout their lives, meaning that it isn't a mistake that women and girls are disproportionately affected by all the issues we're talking about today. For me, especially modern slavery, it's actually a systematic choice that's been created, and it is one that we can absolutely fix. It's a man-made system of inequality, and one that we absolutely need to tackle head on.
And when you say man-made, those words are deliberate, huh?
They are quite deliberate. We are talking about systems of patriarchy.
Yeah.
And do you know, Melissa, I've just made an observation here. We have represented on this panel 3 generations of women. Like I'm making assumptions about our different age groups, but I'm assuming here we have 3 generations of women represented here. And for each generation, this is a persistent issue, a persistent concern among generations. I think that speaks volumes.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Grace, I want to congratulate you and Walk Free for the new report, Stacked Odds. And I would really encourage audience members to look at the report. It's available on walkfree.org online. The report is packed full of fascinating information, personal stories from women around the world at different ages and stages of life, and full of beautiful photos. And so it's one of the most important things it does, apart from that, is actually look at the factors that sit behind Walk Free's estimate that 71% of all victims of modern slavery are women and girls. That is an extraordinary statistic, 71%. So Grace, could you tell us more about Walk Free and about the findings of the Stacked Odds report and what this means for girls and women worldwide?
Yeah. So Walk Free is an international human rights group focused on the eradication of modern slavery in all its forms in our lifetime. We are an all-female team, currently a little bit geographically isolated from one another, across Australia and around the world. What we have found through being the producers of the world-leading data set on measuring and understanding slavery, which underpins all domestic and international law on the subject, is that this is an intrinsically gendered issue. Slavery at its core is a manifestation of extreme inequality. And we see the two going hand in hand in many environments. And of course, this year we've seen that vulnerability compounded. What we wanted this report to lay bare was that empowering women and girls and ending modern slavery must go hand in hand, and that it is foundational to any effort of creating genuine, sustainable development for all people, not just for a privileged few. So conservatively, the report has found that 29 million women and girls are currently living in modern slavery. And when I say conservative, I mean seriously conservative. One, because we can't measure in countries at war, and secondly, because we can't yet understand the predicted ramifications of COVID-19 on this subject, but yeah, let me just say that is a baseline estimate. And to frame that in our context of this beautiful environment where we sit today, we know that there are more women and girls living in slavery than there are people living in Australia. And that is a really astounding statistic, I think. And again, this report is called Stacked Odds because it looks at that vulnerability starting from conception and throughout life. And the report does break down that vulnerability through every age gap. And essentially, this begins with male preference. So something that I wanted to, ask the audience today is, of these three advancements in technology, aeroplanes, asbestos, and an ultrasound, what do you think has caused the most death? Oh. The answer is an ultrasound, because when people could see what gender their child was, that male preference became a dominant and extreme force across many countries in our region, and one that is also experienced here in Australia, not so much in that extreme manifestation, but male preference is in every single part of the world. And from that point, a girl is often framed as an economic burden on her family. That makes her then far more vulnerable to a forced or child marriage. That prevents her from going to school. It prevents her from fully and freely participating in her society. And these cultural, economic, and legal roadblocks stack the odds against girls, preventing them from ever being able to reach a position of leadership, let alone one where they can make basic decisions relating to their body and future. So the report is pretty hardcore. It does lay bare this vulnerability around the world and in every country, but it's also a policy roadmap on how to change these odds. And that roadmap and the entire report is informed on by survivors around the world. And I encourage everyone to look it up, because it is a powerful testimony that we are hoping governments and businesses cannot look away from.
Thanks, Grace. Dr. Kaplanian, based on your experience researching cultural violence and forced marriage, can you tell us more about what's happening in Australia and abroad, and what are the biggest challenges for women and girls in this situation?
Sure. In Australia, we have recently started to recognise the issue of forced marriage, which is a very good thing. However, it is in the law under the Anti-Trafficking and Slavery Act. So that in its own is a challenge. It's a significant challenge, because for many people who are experiencing forced marriage, what the main challenge is for them is, number one, not recognizing that actually they are in forced marriage. So even though there is so much more awareness around us, in Australia, we are talking more freely about the issues of domestic violence, intimate partner violence. We're really not talking that much about the issue of forced marriage. And what is a forced marriage? So the challenges as well is that forced marriage is not an issue that exists in solidarity or in isolation. It's an issue that we cannot look at in isolation, because it is so intersected with the issue of family and domestic violence. And the language that you may recognize me using at the moment is I'm not using intimate partner violence or domestic violence, because forced marriage is an issue that is so intrinsic within the family context. It's not a stranger who decides the marriage of your young child. Often it is your mother or your grandmother or your father. And for you as a young person, often a woman, a young girl, you want to follow in the steps of your parents. You want to follow in the steps of what will not bring shame onto your culture. In Australia, we're an extremely multicultural and diverse community. We cannot lump the experiences that a white Western woman who speaks English and is educated and experiencing domestic violence the same as a refugee young woman who cannot speak English and is so isolated in her community. So what we really need to bring to fore is that family and domestic violence is not a homogeneous issue. It is one that is diverse in its existence amongst us. It's one where we need to start really taking the time into acknowledging the narrative of each victim survivor. And this is what we are not doing properly in Australia. So one of the main things that I really hope to bring back from my Church of Fellowship, which even though it's on the issue of family and domestic violence, it is obviously going to touch on the issue of forced marriage significantly. And I will be investigating the best models of practice that are happening around the world. And I really hope to bring this back to Australia to show the strong evidence of what we need to do better and how. So, yeah, there's so much more that I can say, but we are constrained to time. So.
Yeah. Could you just tell us what are some of the support services that are available for survivors and what is missing?
Sure. I have to be very careful about how I need to be very polite in the way I speak here.
No, you don't. It's disruptive.
Sure. So,
I think I'm not sure how many people in this audience are aware that forced marriages happen in Australia in birth.
I will tell you the statistic, please. So, first of all, as I said before, forced marriage is under the legal framework of anti-slavery and trafficking. So in the 2019-20 year, we have had in Australia about 228 instances where these issues were reported to the Australian Federal Police. 92 of these, 92, you may think, oh wow, that's a bit of a big number. 92 of these were instances of forced marriage. But let me tell you this, the 92 is a gross underestimation of the reality of the problem. Can I say maybe, and I'm just throwing out a number there, but I don't want to say I'm an expert in this area, but I'm pretty sure that it is kind of close to it. Can we say maybe 1,000? Over 1,000? Yes, we can. And that shows us how complex and how hidden this issue is. Because the system that is put in place to support these people coming forward is actually not supporting them at all. So if you are a young person who is forced into a marriage and you want to seek help, the way you can get help is to go to the Australian Federal Police. Now let me tell you this. If you come from a culture where your identity is so collectively intertwined with your family, how are you going to go and dob the members of your family in? If your livelihood is dependent on your family, how are you going to do that? If dobbing them in is a matter of your life or death, and even if you are taken and hidden away in safety, you will live the rest of your life looking behind your shoulder, living in fear, living in an extreme amount of guilt to what you have done to your family. Are we taking into account these complexities? No, we're not. We're not absolutely. So if I am a victim survivor of a forced marriage, they have recently changed the system where currently now I can get 200 days of support through the STPP program, which is mainly the Red Cross program, okay? But if I need more support, so that's less than a year, right? Your whole life changes in less than a year. If I need more support after the 200-day lapses, I have to be engaged in a criminal proceeding with the Australian Federal Police. So one of my colleagues in the UK, who is, her name is Professor Aisha Gill. She is a very close mentor and colleague of mine. Her area of expertise is in forced marriage. And she tells me every time I talk to her, I don't know what you guys are doing there in Australia. Like, why are you doing this? And my response to her is, I'm just a very small fish in this puddle. But, you know, it only takes one person. And there's more than one person who is trying to raise the voice to change this. But it's going to take time. And at the heart of this, we really have to understand the complexity of the issue at hand.
Okay.
So,
Thank
yeah.
you. Thank you for that.
We have a long way to go.
Dr. Ali, what do you think are the current challenges confronting women and girls in Australia at the moment, and is enough being done to tackle?
I wanted to pick up on two things, Melissa, and the first one is with regards to the forced marriage and the legislation around it. It is still incredibly difficult to get a conviction and to get and to get the police to actually prosecute someone on any form of modern slavery. Now, last year, new legislation was introduced into the Parliament, but I stood up in Parliament and argued that the new legislation around anti-slavery did not go far enough, because the new legislation encourages businesses to report on their supply chains and to investigate in their supply chains any forms of kind of modern slavery, but there is no compliance and there is no accountability. The recommendations that we made when I was the Deputy Chair of the Parliamentary Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, and the Deputy Chair of the Human Rights Subcommittee there, we did an investigation, an inquiry into modern slavery. We made a recommendation for an anti-slavery commissioner, as they have in the UK. We made a recommendation for compliance for businesses to have to report on their supply chains and the use of modern slavery, or the prevalence of modern slavery in their supply chains. And we made a recommendation for accountability where businesses fail to account for the use of modern slavery in their supply chains. None of those were taken up in the current legislation. So in my opinion, one of the biggest issues that we have is that the legislation has no teeth. It's not strong enough. We need much stronger legislation for women in Australia in order to allow police to be able to prosecute and utilise the laws that are there, but for businesses to hold them accountable as well. Now, as some here in the audience might know, I'm a survivor of domestic violence myself. At the ripe old age of 25, I found myself fleeing an abusive marriage with a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And just last year in Parliament, the Parliament stood together and expressed its deep, deep regret at the horrendous murder of Hannah Clark and her children by her estranged husband. Yet another domestic violence that ended in the tragic death of a woman. And I remember standing there in Parliament and thinking of myself when I was 25, living in the burbs with a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. Let me tell you, there is no way on earth that I would have turned on the television watched some politicians standing there talking about domestic violence, lighting a candle and singing Amazing Grace, and that would have made a huge difference to my life. I would have gone, oh, I need to leave. No, right? So we tend to talk a lot, but we need to follow up that talk with the actual support services for women who are, Australian women who are living in domestic violence, who are living in slavery conditions, and who are who have experienced forced marriage. And until we have a stronger legislative framework to do that, but until we also have a cultural change in Australia as well, and until politicians, I'm sorry, I know I'm one, but until politicians recognise that their talk doesn't actually make any difference, you actually have to follow up talk with doing something, then nothing will change.
And as someone in leadership, you are responsible.
Absolutely, absolutely, Grace. And I think about that all the time. Like, I was actually really angry that day in Parliament when everyone stood up, and it was all like, because I knew that tomorrow everyone would forget.
Absolutely.
That's what I knew. I knew that tomorrow everyone would forget. And I knew that everyone thought, oh, me standing here and lighting a candle, oh, someone's going to see that and it's going to make a difference to their lives. No, it's not. If you have not been in that situation, then you need to sit down, shut up, and listen to the people who have.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely. So, Grace, I want to talk a bit now about the female labour exploitation in the supply chain. Where is this happening, and where do the products of exploitation end up? And is there any chance that those of us here have actually touched products that are tainted by slavery?
Every single person here has touched a product made by slavery. Probably even just today you have, because it is literally stitched into our global economy in such a formalised way. Because of COVID-19, we've been able to see what a mass disruption looks like to, at the greatest expense of us, our convenience, but someone's actual life and well-being. That has shown the vulnerability of our system in a way that we can no longer ignore. So part of what the Global Slavery Index measures is industries of high risk of modern slavery. And as I said, modern slavery does exist in every country in the world. But of course, where we have issues of stunted development, conflict, displacement, mass corruption, slavery in correlation is worse. And what we started seeing was a narrative of some countries looking better and some parts of the world looking worse, and then countries, say in the G20, going, oh, well, it's not that bad here, focus all your efforts there. Wrong. The G20 is responsible as the world's most powerful nations with the greatest economic reach for the exploitation in a lot of these countries. And this goes back to historical slavery, colonisation. You can trace those pathways to where exploitation existed then and where exploitation existed now. But to come back to industries, we measured just 5 in the last Global Slavery Index. 5 high-risk industries of modern slavery in that supply chain. And we found that collectively the G20 had a $354 billion import risk, this is in US dollars, of goods at high risk of modern slavery, which reframes the question of who is responsible for this exploitation. Well, all of us are. Of course, the onus doesn't sit on the consumer on fixing this. It sits on the multinational company. But we as consumers must let these businesses know that we care about it, because by doing that, we can actually change a conversation in a boardroom. And I've seen that happen in the time I've been in this space. Nowhere near as far as we need it to go, but I have seen a cultural shift there. So just 2 industries that I'll touch upon today. One is seafood. Australia imports 70% of its seafood from Thailand, 80% of its frozen seafood from overseas. I guarantee you cannot buy a tin of tuna that isn't touched in some way by modern slavery. The dolphin tick, the Greenpeace tick, it means nothing for labour rights. And I think this is a bigger conversation, a problematic one around what is sustainability. For me, sustainability cannot exist unless it also includes the basic human rights and well-being of people. Otherwise, it's just rubbishy greenwashing. And I guarantee you an organisation that helps animals and the environment while exploiting people doesn't actually do any of them at all. It's just a big fat sign. So sustainability cannot exist without the basic protection of all people. Another industry which is closer, well, it is here for every single one of us today, is fashion. So fashion is identified as number 2 of the top risk industry to modern slavery and exploitation. It also is number 2 for the worst environmental impact. So it has a lot to account for. And what I can tell you is that unless a brand is telling you explicitly what they are doing to protect all people in their supply chain, supplying people with a living wage, which is not glamorous. A living wage just means you can put food on the table for your kids and keep a roof over your head. It doesn't mean anything about getting ahead. It just means that we're not benefiting from somebody else's poverty in the clothes that we buy. That is actually a rarity. And some interesting information that came out on this between Deloitte Access Economics and Oxfam, so obviously an organisation focused on fair trade, found that for big retailers like Kmart and Big W and Target to pay a living wage to all their workers, 80% of them being female in the textile industry in countries like Bangladesh, what would it cost the consumer? What would it cost to pay these people a living wage? And people guessed a whole range of numbers, but what it found was that the cost of the consumer would be 1%. And we argue organisationally that the business should absorb that cost because they've created the problem, so they should damn well fix it. So we're not talking about things becoming dramatically more expensive. I'm not in the business of telling people to buy niche, ethical brands. If you can do that, that's fantastic, but that's not what's going to end slavery. We need this to be a centralised, accessible part of our economy. I don't think anyone wants to buy anything that harmed another human being in the process. And yet right now that is the norm. And each and every one of us, if we raise our voice, if we let the brands that we wear, that we buy, that we care about this, they will shift and move. And just, if I may, one example, it was a fast fashion retailer just this year called Boohoo. And whenever I say their name, I know it always makes the lawyers in our team twitch. They're like, oh, Grace, they could sue you. And honestly, I dare them to sue me. I would love it. I would love to stand up in a court of law and run through every single labour abuse they have done. It would bring me great joy, and I dare them to do it. So what we found is that they were paying their workers in the UK, this is in UK soil, half the minimum wage. These workers were first forced to work through lockdown without PPE, many of whom became extremely unwell. This was against the UK domestic law, and I guarantee you that if these are the workers in the UK, imagine a far worse environment for their workers offshore. And this company was caught red-handed with this abuse, and ironically making t-shirts that said, let's all stick together, pandemic pals, and all this rubbish. And I think what we need to realise is that the greatest oxymoron of all of this is feminist merch that say things around International Women's Day like girls can, made in Bangladesh by girls who absolutely cannot. And I don't think any of us can call ourselves a feminist unless our empathy extends to the people who make our clothes, to the people who make the products we buy and use every single day. We live in a globalised world and we are accountable to each other. And those with power and privilege, those with a platform, those with a voice, have the greatest responsibility to change these odds.
Fantastic. Grace, I think it's really important what you said there about when we talk about sustainability in fashion. I have a particular interest in the fashion industry, but when we talk about sustainability in fashion, you're right. It's all about disposable wear and fast fashion. Rarely do we see the discussion around sustainability in fashion also being about the exploitation of the workforce and about modern slavery in fashion. There is the Ethical Fashion Report that looks at that as well. I often encourage people to buy Australian made because for Australian fashion designers it's really difficult to break into a domestic or an international market. But within the Australian fashion industry there is such an awareness and a cognizance of not just environmental sustainability, but also of having ethical fashion in terms of their supply chains and where they source their fashion, where they source their labour. That's what I would put out there as a message is let's talk about sustainability, not just about the environmental sustainability, but about human sustainability. I think that's such a powerful message there.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we just come back, Grace, to the industries? You've mentioned two of them, the seafood and fashion industry. What are some of the other industries that we should all be aware of?
Well, technology leads the chase in the most vulnerable area. So again, it's a hard pill to swallow that all of us, a majority of us in this audience would have a phone or a laptop, and we've been talking about conflict minerals, you know, Melissa, you know more about this than most people. Conflict minerals and what that means in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, who is exploited for what price and who gets the best price on that. The fact that you can buy an iPhone for $2,000 that could still have traceable leads to child labour and human slavery is quite horrifying. And so what this comes back to is transparency and about accountability. They must go hand in hand. Transparency in and of itself doesn't create the change we need, but without it, we cannot build true sustainability. And the legislation that Anne touched on about the Modern Slavery Act, there is a long way to go on that legislation. There is, but what it has started is Walk Free's 10-year birthday is next year. And when we first started this organisation, modern slavery was a term that it just wasn't a term. It wasn't understood. It was actually illegal in some countries to say the words. And now it is written into international law, into the Sustainable Development Goals. It was brought in under a conservative government who initially told us this is not going to happen, and within 2 years it did come through, and that's no in small part because of the opposition banging it forward every step of the way. But what we found when we put it forward was that businesses who already had to comply to the UK Modern Slavery Act were champions of what this legislation would mean. And, you know, across every industry where supply chains are multinational, you will find modern slavery unless a business is extremely proactively looking for it. And in the race for the acquisition of PPE this year, and granted it is unprecedented, the crisis that we are living in, and we are the blessed state in the fact we can all meet here today, but it's not a mistake. It's not an accident that we can't trace a lot of where that PPE was made. It's not an accident that a huge amount of that PPE ended up in our waterways and ended up killing animals in our natural environment. It's not an accident. It's how our system was built. Our system was built at convenience at the cost of literally anything else. And to further that question, it's not just convenience, it's convenience for who? And it's the convenience for the top few percent. And I just don't think any of us want to live in a world where that is the reality, because it is the living Hunger Games of our convenience costing someone their basic human rights and freedom. It's just not good enough. And I think this year does provide us with an opportunity to look at this ugliness in the face and say, we're actually not going to tolerate that anymore.
So thank you for that, Grace. Now what can we as consumers, as individuals, as citizens do to improve the situation?
I think that the first thing that we can all do is, one, understand the problem. And by doing that, we inform our voice, and hopefully our voice informs our purchases and our vote. I can't tell you how many businesses I've spoken to this year, from small niche fashion retailers to big supermarket chains, that are critically aware, because of the Modern Slavery Act conversations, of the risk of exploitation in their supply chains. But they're not really sure if they should commit the resources to it that they could to actually fix this problem, because frankly, they're not sure that consumers care. And for me, we cannot leave any shadow of a doubt that we care about this. When you shop at a supermarket, you want to know that you're not buying something that was made by a child, or that was made in a situation of extreme exploitation. And with sugar, coffee, technology, fashion, seafood, it's all there. So I think, one, it's raising our voices, and a simple way we can do that is literally asking, who made my clothes? Where did this cotton come from? There's an app called Good On You. It's free. It rates brands from the environment perspective, labour perspective, and animal perspective. But it is also about holding governments to account, because this is the responsibility of lawmakers. And coming back to the gendered issue that we're talking about today, there are legal roadblocks all over the world that prevent women and girls from fully and freely participating. Right now in 2020, there are still 136 countries that fall short on criminalising forced and child marriage. It's not illegal for those things to happen. And I think that Australia, you know, we have seen a bit of a rise in nationalism and isolationism this year, and I just don't think that's good enough. I think we need to lead into the fact that we could be a regional leader engaging in genuine conversation for the rights of all women and girls, well, all people, but especially women and girls, to ensure that no country in our region, in our backyard, is allowing forced and child marriages to continue to occur, to continue to underpin the trajectory of women and girls' pathways around the world. And this isn't just the right thing to do, the smart thing to do for human rights, it's also the imperative thing to do for economic growth and sustainable development. So even if people in power don't care about the human rights angle, just focus on the economic one. It makes sense for both.
Yeah, great. Now, Carol, Anne, did you want to add to that? Talk about what consumers, what individuals, what business, what governments can do to improve the situation?
Obviously, with my experience working, it's quite a niche area. Grace and experience is a bit much broader. For me, it's all about awareness. I think we all have the responsibility to be aware about how intertwined all of these issues are. We're talking about forced marriage or trafficking or servitude or slavery. They're all very intertwined issues, and I absolutely agree with everything that has been said today. For me, it's about the governments and organizations taking this so much more seriously, and for a conversation like this to happen on a more minuscule scale every day. It's integral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Melissa, I want to make the point that I think too often we use the cultural argument.
Yeah.
Where we say, oh, you know, that's somebody's culture or that's their traditions, and we accept for women and girls in other countries what we wouldn't accept for Australian women and girls. And I think that kind of holding different standards, I think, is really detrimental. Like Grace said, we have not just an opportunity but a responsibility
Absolutely.
in our region to ensure that we do uphold standards for the rights of women and girls across the region, and not just for our own citizens. So I think too often we use that cultural argument. I mean, I know that even for me, when I was seeking help, it wasn't members of my own community or my own family. It was a judge who told me, oh, your culture has ways of handling this. You don't need to get a violence restraining order against your husband that just beat you up, right? We cannot continue to make excuses and accept this cultural argument. I think in terms of what we can do as consumers, yes, we absolutely have to show businesses that this is something we care about, that we do not want to be purchasing products that have used child labour. But also, I think it's important for people to understand in the kind of work that I did, these issues of child labour, human trafficking, all of these aren't just, like I said earlier, cultural issues. Transnational organised crime groups use child labour in fairly benign industries that you wouldn't think of in order to raise money and as part of their criminal activities. Terrorist organisations use these forms of raising money in order to carry out terrorist activities. So this isn't something that just affects or happens in a silo. There are criminal consequences and criminal elements in all of this as well. And if you don't, I hate to say, but if you don't care about the welfare of a woman or a child or a girl child, then care about the fact that on a transnational scale, on an international scale, the exploitation of a woman or a girl is being used to fund some pretty horrific criminal activity.
Dr. Nikita Malik is an incredible expert in this space. She works for the Henry Jackson Society in the UK, and she released a report a few years ago looking directly at how ISIS could keep funding itself through the enslavement and trafficking of women and girls. It was really quite sophisticated the way they were doing it. But yeah, slavery is the most profitable organised crime in the world. So if you don't care about any of the human rights stuff we're saying, this is making the world less safe. And I think, if I may, I just want to add that on the cultural argument, one, if you look at stacked odds, it's not, this isn't my opinion, it's not the perspective of our international team even. This is the empowered voice of women at the front And if you're not going to listen to them to change things, then nothing will ever change. And I think that patriarchal power structures and cultures will never serve or uphold the rights of women and girls unless we allow space for those women and girls who have previously been oppressed and silenced to speak up. So I agree. I think the cultural argument is often such a red herring, especially when the tone is being set by a group of men. Because, it's not in the interest of them to women to speak up, to lean into their power and to lean into their voice. And I think it's a red herring and a disservice to all women and girls everywhere to use as an excuse.
Yeah, excellent. And I mean, these issues flow through in so many different areas of life. Just think about banking and about how the major banks have facilitated child trafficking through the allowing money laundering to be occurring without properly cracking down on it as they're required to do under legislation. You know, we all have responsibility to hold these institutions to account and to be constantly watchful. Look, we're almost out of time. Just one last question for each of our panel members. What does a better world mean for women and girls, and how do we get there? Why should we invest in women and girls? Dr. Ali?
So I'll start off with what does a better world mean for women and girls. I think we need to imagine what a better world looks like for women and girls. And, in so many places around the world, the birth of a girl child isn't welcomed with ululations and cigars and celebrations. It's welcomed with commiserations and shaking of heads. Until a girl child is valued as much as a boy child, that's not going to change. But, we cannot, as a progressive society in Australia, sit back and rest on our laurels and pat ourselves on the back of how far we've come in terms of rights and opportunities to education, to employment, to economic, social and political participation for women. Because I am not prepared to celebrate the advances of women until every single woman can celebrate with me. And I think that's a principle that we need to adopt in this country as well. Why should we invest in women and girls? Research shows that in communities where women are financially empowered, the women spend the money on the family and on the community. And the impact of that financial empowerment comes back to the community, to the society, and to improving the status of everybody in that society. When men are financially empowered in those communities, they spend the money on themselves. They don't invest the money back into their families or into their communities. That is why we need to invest in women and girls. There's a report that comes out every year on economic freedom. We know that in countries where women have economic freedom, they are less likely to be terrorism. There's less likely to be internal conflict. There's less likely to be instability. What we do for women and girls matters. It matters in every nation in the world. And it matters for every nation in the world. What we do here matters for the countries in our region, and what we do in the region, countries in our region and around the world, matters for us as well. So we need to put the focus on women and girls. For a better world, we need to invest in women and girls.
Thank you, Dr. Ali.
Thank you.
Dr. Carroll?
I agree with everything that Anne said, but it's also very easy for me to sit here and say we have to focus on women and girls we have to focus on women and girls for equality between men and women, because the reality is that for this to happen, it's not as easy as we'd like it to be, but it can happen. It can happen with the consistent education about this. I look at my own experience, for example, working in a refugee camp for some time, and I remember for a 30,000 population, there was a tiny school for all the children there. And who do you think was prioritized to go and get an education? The boys. The girls were only allowed to go and get educated at that school for 2 hours a week. 2 hours a week. Because it was said within the camp that it's not them that we have to invest in. It's the boys. They are the leaders. And it's very easy for me to sit here as a Middle Eastern Arab woman who, I could have been one of these people. I could have been one of those who are voiceless, who are forced into marriage, but I'm not. So I really understand my privilege, and it's also very important for us, every person who's sitting here, to understand the privilege that we do have, to understand the freedoms that we do have, the freedoms of putting clothes on our back, to be informed about what we can do, the freedom to be educated and to make informed choices in our life, because these are privileges.
And to use that freedom
Absolutely.
to help others who don't
And
have
to
it.
use that freedom to actually give others a voice that they never dream of having.
Yeah.
So for me, that is what it means to invest in a world, to invest in a girl, to invest in a child, because that's where the difference will come from as well.
Thank you, Dr. Kapranian. And I'll leave the last word to Grace.
I think I'll just end with that note on freedom. This can't be about just the privileged girls. It can't be about the exceptional girls. It has to be about every single girl. And the reality is, these three women here who I'm sitting with, they are all exceptional, and they've had to fight incredibly hard to be where they are in their careers and to have the voice that they have. That in and of itself is amazing. It's a move against gender inequality, but we need to speed up the process, and we know that creating gender equality, again, this is not fancy stuff. It's allow a girl to have basic choice over her body and her future, allow her to have equal education, allow her to make choices relating to her body and her future. These things unlock the potential of every other sustainable development goal. It is the goal that untaps many more. So if you're going to pick 5 out of the 17, or if you're going to pick one, this is the one. It underpins everything that we're talking about today. And by investing in women and girls, we unlock 50% of the world's potential, which literally means everyone wins. So I think we cannot keep progressing. As those of us here who have freedom, that's not by accident. Other people fought very hard for us to have that in whatever capacity is, whether we can vote, whether we can speak up, whether we can be in parliament. People fought really hard for that. And I think my point is that the fight isn't over. Those of us who have it now have to extend it back. We can't keep moving forward while so many, the majority of women and girls, are systematically held back.
So would you, could I please ask our audience to thank our wonderful panellists? And I'd like to thank you to the audience for being here today. Sorry about that. Please, a reminder that the Walk Free gazebo is up here, and you can obtain a booklet to take with you, a photo booklet, photos done by Grace Forrest. And visit walkfree.org, because you'll find that stacked odd reports there, and that is really valuable tool to read. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa, Grace, Anne and Carol.